This morning in the welcome, we mentioned that today is the last Sunday in the church's calendar. You may not have known this, but the church has its own calendar that we follow besides the annual yearly calendar that we may be more accustomed to, January through December. The church has its own, and today is the last Sunday in that calendar. So next Sunday, you can tell each other Happy New Year and confuse everybody who wasn't here today or who didn't remember because Thanksgiving happened in between the Sundays. But every end of the church calendar year, we end with this day where we commemorate Christ as King. So the Sunday that ends the liturgical year is called Christ the King Sunday, or you may hear other people refer to it as Reign of Christ, like Christ is reigning as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So the readings today assigned by the church calendar include the ones we had this morning, Jeremiah 23, where God is condemning the shepherds of Israel, those who had been put in charge over God's people as human leaders, either religious or political, and how they've failed in their duties to shepherd, to literally care for the people of God. And then, of course, we have this famous reading from Luke's gospel, the crucifixion account found in all four gospel readings about the end of Jesus' life and how we treated Jesus as King of God's people. I want to begin our Christ the King Sunday by offering you this quote, and I want you to hold the tension with me for just a few minutes. This quote comes, of course, from my guiding light, one of the people I love to learn from, Chris E.W. Green, who is a theologian and a bishop in a church denomination. But Chris E.W. Green says this in one of his sermons: God is more unlike than like anything we know, but God is most unlike the great man, the man of power, the monarch, the emperor. This is the most doubtful image of God, the most misleading. So I want you to hold those words from Bishop Chris Green in your mind, while also holding the fact that we have this holiday on the church calendar, this feast day called Christ the King. How do we hold both statements together at once? That Christ is both King of Kings and Lord of Lords, as the book of Revelation proclaims him to be, and also that God is most unlike the great man, the man of power, the monarch, the king. How do you hold them together? About 100 years ago, Christ the King Sunday came into being in the church calendar. It's the newest holy day, holiday, that we have as Christians in our annual liturgical year. And it came through one of the popes who acknowledged that there was a rising sense of nationalism and fascism in the continent of Europe. So in response to what was happening in the countries of Spain and Italy and ultimately in Germany, this pope declared that Christ alone is the true and sole authority over people all over the world. That while we acknowledge many different leaders, only Christ holds the kind of authority that we often attribute and assign to others. And yet, at the same time, we believe as Christians that God is unlike all the different kinds of analogies and metaphors and images that we try to prescribe to God. And that God is most unlike a king or a lord or a monarch. We, the past few weeks, have been talking about identity. If you've been here since the beginning of November, you've noticed that the church's assigned readings in the lectionary, which is just our 3-year cycle of readings that we use as a worldwide church, the lectionary has been giving us passages from Luke's gospel that talk a lot about both the identity of God and the identity of people who follow God. You remember on All Saints Sunday when we had the passage from Zacchaeus? Zacchaeus is called all kinds of things by his fellow community members, but only Jesus in that passage calls Zacchaeus by his name, his true identity, which shows us that God really knows who we are. God doesn't mistake us for all the things we try to make of ourselves or other people try to label us as. No, God really knows us for who we've been made to be. And then we had examples from the Sadducees who bring this confusing parable to Jesus and talk about the resurrection life and give this metaphor or this example of a woman who's been married to 7 different brothers over her life, and then they all die. So in the age to come, in the resurrected state, who will she belong to? And of course, Jesus reminds us that this woman belongs to no one except God alone, that she's more than just one who bears kids to extend a name, but she has worth and value and dignity because she is made by a God who is living, a God of the resurrection who continues to surprise us in amazing ways. When we think that all is lost, that we're at a dead end in life, God can come up with new creative ways like resurrection to bring about a future we couldn't have imagined before. And then, of course, last week we had different encounters about the identity of those who suffer as Jesus' followers. What are we to do as people who inevitably encounter pain in our world? And Jesus invites us to not make sense of the pain by trying to assign it cause or trying to assign it practical value, like it's going to help me be growing as a person, but instead, we're invited to look for God who enters into the pain with us, who journeys with us when we suffer, promising that we are not alone. And all of this culminates in this passage today from Luke's gospel, where God really is suffering, the crucified one, but also the one we proclaim as king. If you notice in all four accounts of the crucifixion, the gospel writers make sure to mention that there is a charge above Jesus' head on the cross. This is the King of the Jews. It's in all four accounts, which means we should probably pay attention to it. Now, this would have been something that the religious and military authorities would have put up as a way to mock Jesus. If he is really the messianic one, the one claimed and sent by God to free God's people, then how did he end up on a cross? The cross was a torturing execution device, not only to take someone's life, but to dehumanize them in the process. The amount of shame associated with the cross made it a word that was taboo in Roman society. And yet here in these stories, the gospel writers point to the cross and say, that is God. That is our King. In a way nobody could have recognized in the moment as Jesus' contemporaries. So how do we hold these in tension? That Christ is king, and yet God is so unlike anything we know, including, most importantly, the man of power, the great man. Well, I want you to stop for a second and think, what comes to your mind when I say the word king? What images or feelings? Who? What examples? Think about what we associate with kings. Royalty. Maybe it's power. Maybe it's wealth, prestige. Jesus and the Christian tradition challenge us to rethink our basic assumptions about all kinds of words, including the word king. So for some of us who grew up in a country where the monarchy is a real thing, that might be really challenging. Or maybe we've seen the royal weddings on TV, or we've seen the coronation of the most recent British monarch, and so that's the image we have in our mind. Or maybe you lived thousands of years ago in Judea, and the image you have of a king is these shepherds that were mentioned by the prophet Jeremiah. These shepherds who were supposed to be in charge of serving the people, caring for them, but instead used their power and their office to take what they wanted and to abandon the sheep. Or maybe they have an image of a Roman emperor coming in and putting his foot down, saying this is the way it's going to be, or else you end up on a cross. Maybe that's the image of someone in authority you have. But to follow Jesus, to follow the one who is God and who is also crucified, means we need to rethink some very basic assumptions about the word king and about the concept of power. That if Christ really is king and is also the one who was put to death on a cross, we need to come up with some new definitions. I want to lead you back beyond Luke 23 to Luke chapter 4. And if you go to Luke chapter 4, you'll have noticed that this is right after Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. And the moment right after his baptism, he is driven into the wilderness, to the barren wasteland where he is left alone. And we have this story of the tempter, the accuser, the Satan, coming to Jesus and offering him some different ways of living into his vocation. So he's tempted to turn stones into bread to prove himself as God's Messiah. He is tempted to receive all the power of the nations and the rulers if he would just worship Satan instead, find a new place in the chain of command. And then he is tempted to throw himself off the highest point of the temple to tempt God to intervene, to rescue him so that he wouldn't be harmed. All three of these temptations, I believe, are ways that Jesus is challenged to prove who he is by becoming someone he is not. To prove that he is the Messiah, the anointed one, the one who is God's own son, to prove that by doing things that a Messiah would not do, by showing his spectacular power, by demanding the attention of others around him, by finding someone else to give his allegiance and support to. Things that a Messiah wouldn't do, Jesus is told to do by this accuser. And 3 times he refuses the temptations. Why do we bring up the temptation story? Because if you go to Luke 23, you'll have noticed, if you were listening closely, that while Jesus is on the cross at the very end of his life, 3 times he is again tempted to do something that is not aligned with his identity and vocation. 3 times, different people tell him to save himself. You have the leaders among the people mocking him, saying if he really is God's chosen one, he would save himself. You have the soldiers also deriding Jesus, offering him sour wine and then telling him to save himself. And then one of the rebels hanging there on a cross next to Jesus invites him both to save himself and us while you're at it. To be someone he's not. What the Gospels are inviting us to do is to see the world a different way through the lens that is Christ. And to recognize that saving in this moment means Jesus not saving himself, but instead enduring, to stay the course, to not be knocked off balance, but to remain faithful to who God has made him to be and who God has called him to be for us. Which means not seizing what is given as gift, not trying to prove who he is by becoming someone who he is not, but instead to be faithful, faithful unto death. God is more unlike than like anything we know, but God is most unlike the great man, the man of power, the monarch, the emperor. This is the most misleading image of God. That's the quote from Bishop Chris Green. And I want to invite you today to maybe consider redefining the words we use so often, both power and king. This past Tuesday, I was watching basketball because now it's basketball season in my house. It's not football anymore. And so we were watching the Champions Classic, which is an annual game between 4 teams that play each other and they rotate who they're playing. And the first game of the Champions Classic was Michigan State and Kentucky. And my daughter was up. She's 15 months old. She was eating dinner at this time with the TV on. And my wife is trying to teach my daughter words. And one of the most important words you need to learn from a young age is the word Duke. This is the school my wife and I both went to for grad school. This is the school my parents went to before me. And if God is willing and the creek don't rise, Caroline may be blessed to go there as well. So Becca, in an effort, a genuine attempt to teach Caroline this word Duke, points at the TV screen where there's basketball happening between Michigan State and Kentucky and says, "Look, Caroline, Duke." Now, I was horrified. I was appalled, and I immediately intervened, and I told Caroline, that is not Duke. Don't ever believe that is Duke, because the worst thing that could happen as both a Duke alum and a fan of the basketball team is for my daughter, who's 15 months old, to grow up confused, thinking that Duke is actually Kentucky. It's almost as bad as her thinking Duke is North Carolina. It's just a little bit lower. I was horrified and I intervened, but then I realized this is so often the case in our lives as people who grow up in this world, and we're trying to make sense and meaning of all the things around us. And so we begin to attribute ideas to things like power. We begin to attribute meaning to things like rulers and kings, all the while not realizing it's distorting what those things actually are, what power actually looks like, who the king actually is. And so whether we're talking about monarchs, rulers, lords, we begin to throw all these terms around, and then, oh, by the way, we call Jesus that too. And suddenly what we're talking about when it comes to things like power look far different than how the Gospels present it. Today, you're invited to rethink basic definitions about things like kings and power by looking instead to the story of Jesus. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a 20th century theologian, put it, Christianity means a devaluation of all human values and the establishment of a new order of values in the sight of Christ. What that means is when we follow Jesus, we go back to school. We relearn basic ideas and words. And instead, we develop a new language so that when you look at Jesus, you can truly call him king, but in a way that doesn't make sense to anyone else who doesn't know him. Yes, Christ is king, but his throne is a cross. Yes, Christ is Lord of lords, but his crown is a crown of thorns, not of gold. Yes, Christ is Lord of all, but how he reveals that great authority and power is by serving others, not seeking to be served, but to give his life for the many. That God doesn't need to prove how great, how powerful, how amazing God is by coming and lording over us. No, God doesn't need the attention. God comes to be faithful to us. Even when we fail to be faithful to God or faithful to each other or even faithful to ourselves, God still remains faithfully in loving service to us. Christ is king because the way that he is king looks completely different than the way we imagine kings to be. Not assuming power and collecting it to dominate others, but instead giving of himself continually to the point of death, so that others might be empowered to live into their identity. That's one of the most controversial claims about the cross that we're very uncomfortable with as Christians. That we're okay with Jesus being king because of the cross, but we're very uncomfortable with Jesus being king on the cross. We don't like the image of a suffering Messiah. We want a man of power. We want a great man. We want a monarch and an emperor because that's what looks impressive. That's how we've been shaped and formed. That's what we think gets things done. But the gospel stories are here to tell us that it's all backwards. That it's the self-giving love who is our God that truly is power. Because that's a source that never runs out. And as Christians, we're invited not to evade the cross, not to escape it, but to go to the places where crosses are still erected in our world and to go be present with those who suffer. Because we believe when we are in those places of pain, those places where darkness seems to reign, we will encounter nothing less than the presence of Christ, who is King. After one of the rebels on the cross next to Jesus invites Jesus to remember him, what does Jesus say in response? Truly, I tell you, you will be with me in paradise. And I love that promise that Jesus makes, not because of where they're going, but because of the status of their relationship. Jesus doesn't say, you will be under me as my subject. You will be before me, bowing down in my glory. Jesus says, you will be with me, alongside me. And perhaps one of the most shocking claims of all Christian theology is that as king, Christ doesn't want subjects. As Lord, Christ doesn't want slaves like other kings do. No, what Christ wants is you to reign with him. No longer do I call you servants, I now call you friends, John's gospel tells us. And it's true. If we can believe it, just how shocking it is. That Christ doesn't want us to be beneath him. That God is always lower. That's what's revealed in the image of the suffering servant who is Christ, who lifts us up so that we might rule alongside him in this self-giving love. That's the identity that you are given as Christ's living body. Will you take it? Will you live into it? Will you trust it that it's actually true, that it's actually for you? There's a story told about Robert and Clarence Jordan. Clarence Jordan, if you don't know him, was the founder of Koinonia Farms, which was a farm in Georgia. And Clarence Jordan, lived there with a community of people of all different races in the 1950s in Georgia. And of course, that meant it came with all kinds of challenges from people who didn't want that existing in their society. So from the jump, Clarence Jordan and his group faced all kinds of obstacles, including having their water and power turned off, having people not only vandalize their equipment and their farm, but threatening them with violence. And so one day when their power and water were turned off, Clarence went to his brother, Robert. Robert Jordan was running for political office in Georgia at the time, had great political aspirations to do something great with his name, and yet here comes his brother asking for help in this really challenging situation, a situation that was, rather controversial in 1950s Georgia. So Clarence comes to his brother and says, "We need you to represent us in court as we seek to have our water restored." And Robert says, "Clarence, I can't do that. I have all of these dreams for myself of who I could become, and representing you could put all that at risk or even mean I lose it all." And Clarence says to his brother, "Robert, we might lose everything too." So Robert turns to his brother Clarence, the leader of Koinonia Farm, and says, "Clarence, it's different for you all at Koinonia Farm." And then Clarence says this. He says, "It's not different at all, because when you and me were kid brothers, we went down the aisle at our small church. We made the same profession of faith to follow Jesus as both Savior and Lord. Robert, I'm doing that. How about you?" Robert Jordan, the aspiring political leader, said to his brother, "I follow Jesus up to a point." Clarence says, "Could that point be, by any chance, the cross?" Robert, confident in his response, say, "Yes, Clarence, I follow Jesus to the cross, but not up on it." So then Clarence looks at his older brother, caught up in the world of politics, and says, "Robert, I don't think you're a disciple. I think you're an admirer. I think you should go back to that church where we gave our lives to Christ and tell them you're only an admirer of Jesus and not a disciple." Robert says, exasperated to his brother, "If we all followed Jesus like that, we wouldn't have a church." Clarence said to his brother, "The question is, do you have a church?" I love that story between the brothers because I think it highlights the challenge we all face in following Jesus as King. That we're willing to follow him to some extent, but perhaps not to the places he actually calls us to be with him. That when it gets challenging and uncomfortable, when it gets hard on us and we have to sacrifice something or give something to somebody else, we stop. And that's the point where we begin to go our own way. And so Clarence Jordan's words haunt me. Am I just an admirer? Or am I truly a disciple? But friends, the promise is this. When we follow him to the places where crosses still hang with people on them, we find ourselves to be nothing less than the body of Christ. And mystically, spiritually, we are incorporated into something that's much greater than our own lives. So if it's not Clarence Jordan and Koinonia Farm, if it's not Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, what could it be for you today? How is God calling you to reign right now as part of Christ's body here in this world? Because make no mistake, Christ is reigning through you. That is how God chooses to be king. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.